Welcome back to another episode of Bare Bones Physiology, a podcast where we discuss exercise at large in disease, aged, and healthy populations through recent published scientific literature. My name is Andrew, and next to me is Mohamed. And today, Mohamed will lead our discussion centered around carb feeding and oral mouth rinsing with regard to carbs regarding exercise. So before I pass it along to Mohamed, I want to mention that whatever's discussed on this podcast is in no way associated with our current academic institution. The thoughts, opinions, and interpretations of today are solely our own. With that, I'll now pass it along to Mohamed so he can get us started. Mohamed, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Andrew. So today, as Andrew mentioned, we're going to be talking a little bit about carbohydrates and exercise, in particular when it relates to feeding, as well as when it relates to mouth rinsing, which has been something that has been under a lot of scrutiny, but at the same time, a lot of research, and there's been a lot of ways that it's been looked at. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about today is sort of trying to identify a little bit of the foundations of this area of research, because carbohydrates, when it comes in particular to feeding carbohydrates during exercise, prior to exercise, these are all things that have been researched for so long. And I think that it is important that we sort of are up to date with what's happening in relation to that area of research. So the first thing that I will be doing is that I'll be talking a little bit about a study that surprisingly was published in 1986. Can you imagine they used to do science back then? This study, study by Coyle and others in 1986 is one that I think set really the basis for what we're talking about today. And it's a study that had participants go through an endurance exercise protocol in two different conditions. So the first condition being placebo. So participants were fed something that did not have carbs in it. And then the second condition, participants were fed carbohydrates. And the very interesting pattern that they've observed, of course, they tried to identify the division of percent energy expenditure between the athletes to try and understand the contribution of glycogen, the contribution of quote unquote other carbohydrates here being blood glucose and fats. And what they did identify is that when we were looking at the placebo condition, there's a steady drop of glycogen utilization. So percent energy expenditure from glycogen, there's a steady drop in that. However, when we sort of take a little bit of a shortcut and look at carbohydrates in comparison, we actually do notice that the drop in glycogen is happening almost at exactly the same rate. And a little bit of a sort of almost background for our audience here to make sure that everyone's on the same basis in terms of understanding what we're talking about. Glycogen in the body is sort of the stored form of carbohydrates. All right. So the body, what it does is that it could take glycogen stores from the muscles. So let's say, for example, they do any form of exercise, in particular, especially with endurance exercise. You're utilizing glycogen stores that you have in the muscle. But then there's also glycogen in the liver. And when you're doing exercise, you're also utilizing glycogen in the liver. But what does occur is that, let's say, for example, that I run someone through a glycogen depleting exercise. What will happen is that the glycogen in the liver will run out first before the glycogen in the muscles, meaning that the body will do everything in its power to make sure that the muscles do not run out of glycogen. But when the liver does run out of glycogen, that is when you start running out of glycogen in the muscles. So I think that that's really what's interesting about it, when we look at it from a whole body physiology perspective. But that's beside the point. That was a little bit of a segue to make sure that everyone is sort of on the same level of understanding for this. So looking at it, comparing placebo versus carbs, the division between other carbohydrates and fats, other carbohydrates again here being blood glucose, is where it starts getting interesting. So one of the things that happens in placebo is that over time, the dependence on blood glucose actually decreases, and we start having a higher reliance, a higher percent energy expenditure coming from fat oxidation. And that is not surprising, because eventually when you start running out of blood glucose, the body still needs to provide energy so that it can keep on going. So then it's going to start relying on fat oxidation. But when you start comparing it, let's say, in particular, with the carb condition where they're continuously fed carbohydrates, because fat oxidation is a slow way of producing energy, the body sort of starts figuring out a different division, whereby we start depending on other carbohydrates, that being blood glucose, and then sort of almost reducing that reliance on fat oxidation. Because glycogen, in a way, and a little bit of an explainer here, the reason why, for example, we have that steady decrease in glycogen, regardless of if the person is fed a placebo bolus or carbohydrates, is because the body cannot rapidly undergo glycogenesis. It actually sort of decreases over time, regardless of that. So it's starting to run out regardless. So I really hope that was a little bit of a foundation of what's going to be happening, what we're going to be discussing in this podcast. And then I'll be discussing 2 other papers that will show us a little bit of that side of fatigue. Fatigue here, of course, being reduction in force or power output over time during physical activity. And I'll be discussing sort of the perspective of trying to identify the fatigue, what's happening, and in relation to carbohydrates. So the first study that I'll be talking about in relation to the foundation, so still don't get into the papers of this podcast, so a little bit of foundation. So there's a study that was published by Nebo in 2003. And what this study did, interestingly enough, is that it had athletes go through 3 hours of cycling exercise. So those were highly trained cyclists going through that 3 hours of cycling exercise. And then what they did is that they had 2 different things. So they had athletes either take in a placebo bolus or one that had glucose. And what they did find is that when they did a post-fatigue assessment on these participants, and that post-fatigue assessment was one that involved those participants sustaining an isometric contraction for 120 seconds, and every 30 seconds, they'd be given an interpolated twitch. And interestingly enough, what occurred is that there was a preservation of voluntary activation capacity, meaning that the brain was able to activate the muscles for longer compared to, let's say, when they weren't fed anything. Or not fed anything, but rather something that didn't have any carbs in it. So that then shows us that, carbohydrates definitely have something to do with the brain. But then when we compare it with peripheral fatigue, that is, let's say, trying to now think, well, okay, so it does have something to do with the brain. Well, does it have something to do with the muscles? And indeed it does. But this study, the next study that I'll be talking about in relation to the foundation of this topic, is one that is more so relating to mechanically skinned muscle fibers. So an animal study. And that was a study that was done by Ornblad, Westerblad, and Nielsen in 2013. And this study, what it did is that it took mechanically skinned single muscle fibers, put it in, put it through like an exhausting protocol, basically. So sort of like continuously stimulating it until exhaustion. And then after that, taking these mechanically skinned muscle fibers and putting it in a glucose solution. And those 2 glucose solutions, they had sort of different concentrations of glucose. So one of them had 5 millimolars of glucose, and the other had 0 millimolars of glucose, and they were put in there for 60 minutes, and then they sort of ran these muscle fibers through yet another exhausting protocol for that period of time until exhaustion. And lo and behold, what happened is that the mechanically skinned muscle fibers that were placed in glucose were actually able to sustain for longer. And that was attributed by the authors to glycogenesis. But I suspect that there's also some stuff beyond glycogenesis, because there are other studies that do talk as well about the impacts of glucose, especially when it comes to peripheral fatigue, and especially when it comes to the ability of the muscle to sustain its force power output, regardless of the level of activation that the central nervous system is giving it. So I think that that's really what sort of allows us to think about this field of research a little bit more, because within that research, there's been a lot that looked at endurance exercise. Because again, I mean, when you look at, for example, anaerobic types of exercise, high intensity, glucose is not usually what first comes to mind. You start thinking about, well, okay, things like creatine phosphate, anaerobic metabolism, all these things. But at the same time, when you think of more endurance exercise, you're thinking of oxidative phosphorylation, you're thinking of the Krebs cycle, you're thinking of all these things where glucose might have a bigger role to play. So then that is what we're going to do here. We're going to be shifting gears and talking about, well, since it does have a role in endurance exercise, and that has been pretty concrete in the literature, what does it have to do with high intensity exercise? So that brings us into the first study of this podcast. actual study we're talking about. So the effect, it's titled The Effect of Acute Manipulation of Carbohydrate Availability on High Intensity Running Performance, Running Economy, Critical Speed, and Substrate Metabolism in Trained Male Runners. Very short title, if you've noticed. Anyway, not a very short one, but this study is one that did this thing where they said, well, okay, so what we can do is we can perhaps look a little bit at glycogen stores and what glycogen stores have to do with high intensity exercise. So what they did is that they had participants did a familiarization at the start to sort of getting familiarized with the devices and everything that's involved in this study. And then they had them go under a glycogen depleting trial, right? So this glycogen depleting trial, of course, was one that involved them undergoing very high intensity exercise at 75% of their VO2 max for a period of time that was long enough based on previous research to be able to deplete glycogen. But then what they did is that they also sort of had them either go through a high carb condition or a low carb condition. So that high carb condition, so giving them high carbs following that glycogen depleting trial was to make sure that they were not glycogen depleted. But then comparing them with a glycogen depleted trial, they sort of gave them a protein based drink that did not have any carbs in it. And that was again for that goal. And then after that, what happened is that after giving them that snack, then they had them go through sort of 24 hours of either taking in 6 grams per kilogram of body weight per day of carbohydrates or only 50 grams of carbs for the entire day. And then after that, the next morning, they sort of gave them either a high carb intake, they actually gave them a standardized breakfast, and that standardized breakfast was one that had the same components of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So running them through glycogen depletion, giving them standard breakfast, and then having them go through high intensity exercise to see again for example, the running economy is going to be impacted, their performance, their fatigability, all these things. And lo and behold, what happened is that glycogen had no impact on high intensity exercise in any of these parameters. So that really does show us that we do have a not very pronounced role of glycogen depletion when it comes to high intensity exercise. And that's no surprise. And I think that that's what's really great about it, because again, that foundation by Coyle and others, that foundational paper in 1986 absolutely explains what's happening. Because glycogen depletion, I mean, when you think about it, in that paper, in the Coyle and others paper, athletes were able to endure for longer when they were given carbs. But regardless of whether or not they were given carbs, glycogen was depleting at the same rate. So that does show us that glycogen is a lot more pronounced in terms of its impact on endurance exercises as opposed to high intensity exercise. And when we look at, for example, the results of this paper, it is absolutely no surprise that we seem to be having a not very important role of glycogen in terms of how it impacts high intensity exercise. So I think that's what's really interesting about it. And I think it really does spark our thought process a little bit about the important role that carbohydrates play in exercise.
Yeah, definitely. That's an interesting paper, because I think, when we talk about the literature, like, it's okay to publish results that show absolutely nothing between groups. That maybe goes against hypothesis. And spoiler, I have a paper later on that sort of has that as well. But it's cool to see, like you mentioned, we have sort of the extensive foundational knowledge of endurance exercise, and then as we sort of know within exercise physiology, there's so many different components with regard to exercise. We can't just group exercise as solely just exercise. Like, there's different energy systems at play, different muscle groups. Like, there's so many different factors. So certainly the influence of everything that plays with regard to exercise was interesting nonetheless. So very cool paper. So yeah, moving on to my paper now. This one was quite interesting to me. It's titled The Effects of Energy Gel Ingestion on Blood Glucose, Lactate, and Performance Measures During Prolonged Cycling. And the reason why I found this one interesting was it's comparing sort of certainly nothing, right? So a fasted state, but it's comparing sort of manufacturers' recommendations with regard to their products consumption versus what is more typically seen in more practical settings. So a more frequent ingestion of, in this case, carbohydrates. So as you mentioned with regard to endurance exercise, just running through sort of the introduction to this paper, they mentioned a whole host of sort of benefits with regard to endurance exercise and carb sort of supplementation. So I don't want to exhaust that too much because you did a great job sort of explaining that. But it sort of brings in the fact that manufacturers have to get a little bit smarter with how they sort of package and distribute these sources, because carrying around a big bottle is just not that practical, as we'll sort of discuss later on. But so in this sense, looking at energy gels is pretty cool. So yeah, as I mentioned, it's just sort of comparing manufacturers versus what is more typically seen. And they wanted to look at 3 outcomes in particular. So obviously, blood glucose levels, blood lactate levels, as well as a performance of subsequent exercise of 15 minutes. So it's like a 15-minute all-out maximal effort time trial after they're sort of exhausted, or not necessarily exhausted, but their endurance sort of exercise. So certainly looking at the role that carbs might play in that subsequent 15 minutes max effort, which might mimic what you see in a lot of endurance-based settings where, the last 10, 15 minutes, you do have to give it your all and max effort to cross the finish line. And if it's the marathon, then to make the podium, for example. But certainly it's an important factor to look at. So diving a little bit deeper into the 3 conditions. So each subject performed all 3 trials with 4 to 7 days between trials, so enough rest between all 3. And the 3 trials were, the first one being consuming the gel capsule every 30 minutes. So this is the more practical and what is typically seen in endurance events. So a more frequent ingestion of carbohydrates. The second trial was consuming the gel capsule every 45 minutes, which was the manufacturer's recommendation. So frequent, but not frequent enough, as typically seen. And then obviously, as I mentioned before, the third one being a fasted trial. So comparing 3 different ones. Interesting with this paper, it involved 10 trained cyclists, 5 males, 5 females. So we see a sort of an equal representation of an event. So that's quite cool. With regard to the endurance-based portion of the study, it was if they're cyclists, you want to train them with what they're good at. So it was 2 hours of cycling, and it was performed at 70% of their VO2 max. So very submaximal and manageable. And then certainly, as I mentioned before, their third outcome, 15-minute time trial after the 2 hours. So essentially, all that was instructed for these participants was to cover as much distance as possible. So you could sort of expect that it's maximal effort work. Nothing with regard to VO2 max. It was just sort of all out as fast as you can go. Diving into the results now, the results showed that more frequent carb ingestion led to better maintenance of elevated blood glucose. No real surprise there. However, it had no effect on blood lactate levels. Regarding the 15-minute time trial, both carb gel conditions were significantly better compared to fasting. So no real difference between the 2 carb conditions, but certainly significance from no carbs. Yeah, and I say like it wasn't significant between the 2 carb conditions, statistically speaking, but if we were to look at it from more of a practical standpoint, that wasn't statistically significant. So there's a difference between sort of statistical work and then sort of practical application of the results. And the more frequent carb ingestion group actually performed the 15-minute time trial 5% better. So small, but like big enough, right? Like with regard to typical race settings. So something to note there. And then although there was no difference in lactate, significant difference with regard to the 15-minute time trial, especially towards the end of the 15-minute time trial, the more frequent carb ingestion group sort of had a trend with regard to lactate production. So the authors sort of noted with regard to lactate measurements, especially with regard to a glucose-based study, the importance of measuring lactate is due to the presence and availability of glucose affecting the metabolic pathway used for energy production. So they want to dive a little bit deeper into it, and I tried to simplify it as much as possible. But specifically, they were looking at sort of increased glycolytic metabolism, which may increase lactic acid production if the oxidative cycle is unable to process the increased production of pyruvic acid. So it's almost sort of like a backup effect. It's just not able to process it. So with that, the more frequent carb ingestion group may have been producing more energy anaerobically, leading to greater work output, but also sort of a trend with regard to their lactate production. So we see some sort of practical results. Nothing real statistically significant other than the blood glucose measurements maintaining with the more frequent ingestion. But it was a pretty interesting paper because, not too often do you see sort of with regard to these studies is what manufacturers recommend versus what is typically used. So it is kind of cool to see the comparison of the two and seeing which one wins, right? Which one is more practical with regard to race settings, how that affects a lot of physiological markers. So yeah, that's why I sort of thought it was a pretty interesting paper, but yeah.
Very, very interesting, I think, because like when I think about it, people think of all sorts of ways of taking in carbs. And I imagine myself, if I was an athlete, for example, and I'm trying to really like optimize how much carbs I'm taking in, I'm going to think about something that might have, let's say, a higher amount of carbs per grams of that substance.
Yeah.
And then that way, if I'm going on like a cycling exercise type of thing, or perhaps running on a marathon or whatever it is, well, I'm not going to have as much stuff to carry on with me. And then I can take a little bit of like a sip of it or sort of, a bite of whatever that might be. And then that way I should have fueled myself with enough carbs to keep going for X amount of time.
Yeah,
so that cool I think is very, very interesting.
It's cool to see how creative some of these manufacturers can get. And then certainly as more studies go on and sort of show some benefits, to see how creative we can further get, right? Like we're talking about little gels right now. Who knows what it's going to be, right?
Exactly. And that's exactly what it is, because again, like all these manufacturers, as you said, they're going to start getting creative. They're going to start thinking about ways to do it. And speaking of creative, I mean, mouth rinsing has been on the, sort of on the hot seat these days. A lot of people are thinking, well, okay, we eat carbs. That's pretty nice. But what if we sort of mouth rinse with carbs, or not only carbs, maybe even caffeine, as this next study will be doing. And what's interesting to me is that there are some previous studies, and I'm sure Andrew know about them. It's basically these studies that have been talking about, well, mouth rinsing and its impact on, let's say, the central activation of muscles. But then I think about other things like peripheral fatigue and whatnot. And, what does mouth rinsing have to do with that? But that's beside the point, because what this next paper did is that what's titled "The Effects of Carbohydrate and Caffeine Combination Mouth Rinse on Anaerobic Performance of Highly Trained Male Athletes." So right from the get-go that they're going to be doing anaerobic performance, intensity. And what they're doing in this study is that they had 8 highly trained male athletes. They ran them through a couple of conditions. So one condition being carb mouth rinsing, one condition being caffeine only, one condition being caffeine and carbs, and the other condition being placebo. And what they did is that they had them do repeated vertical jumps, 2 times 30 seconds, 5-minute intervals. All right. And then after running them through that, then they'd be testing certain parameters. So let's say the max height that they jumped, the minimum height that they jumped, certain things like lactate, for example, so on and so forth. And of course, they'd have to do all these mouth rinses right before it. And to no one's surprise, that didn't work. It did not affect it whatsoever. So, I mean, it would sort of be interesting to think about it from the perspective of, let's say, endurance exercise, right? Even though this study does not go over endurance exercise, it does talk about high intensity. But when I sort of think about it from the perspective of these other studies that were, let's say, like other meta-analyses or systematic reviews, we can just link it down in the description below. We're not going to go on about it for so long. But there are other studies, let's say, that are saying, well, there are some studies that are like, yeah, with in terms of producing like a 1 rep max, it doesn't seem like mouth rinsing has anything to do with that. But if we're going to think about it from the perspective, well, endurance type exercises, then maybe the pathway, the mouth rinsing potentially, there are people that are suggesting that it potentially affects things like central nervous system and and the central activation of the muscles. Then maybe that's one pathway that mouth rinsing could work through. But even then, these studies are pretty scarce and the data is just all over the place. I mean, when you look at it, there are studies that are suggesting that it does something, studies that are suggesting that it doesn't do anything whatsoever. So it's not a very promising direction, so it seems. But at the same time, it does seem like it is something that indeed needs to be explored more. And I think that that's what this paper showed. I mean, we have results that do not show any significant results, but indeed it does show us that when it comes to high intensity exercise, maybe it's not the best solution or pathway out there. So yeah.
It's a cool concept. But just, the mere thought of rinsing sort of some sort of carb substance in your mouth and then spitting it out, not even like swallowing it, just like spitting it out to have some sort of benefit. It's as you mentioned, it's scarce with regard to literature that's out there, but who knows? I mean, there has to be some reason why they're doing it, right? You would think.
Yes, yeah.
So sort of continuing on with the mouth rinse trend, that's my last paper. So it's titled The Effect of Carbohydrate Mouth Rinse on Resistance Exercise Performance. So yeah, with regard to sort of high intensity exercise, it's never really been thought that a major limitation to performance is carbohydrate depletion. However, there have been some benefits with regard to mouth rinsing, showing some benefits of ergogenic potential. Previous paper didn't. Spoiler, this paper doesn't. But again, that sort of encompasses a lot of different types of exercise as well with regard to that last statement. So yeah, with regard to mouth rinsing specifically, and in the sort of introduction material that was in this paper, they sort of mentioned a lot of fatiguing exercise-based studies and the involvement of mouth rinsing. And they sort of highlighted maybe a potential hole or gap within the literature that they wanted to look at. They wanted to look at maybe the ramp up of submaximal exercise leading into fatiguing exercise. So the mouth rinsing with regard to submaximal exercise, and then the effects of that on maybe a fatiguing set of resistance exercise. So potential gap that they wanted to look at. And yeah, with regard to the purpose of this paper, word for word, it was to look at the effects of mouth rinsing with carbs in between sets of submaximal bench pressing and its effects on maximal repetition performance, so max effort. So the study involved both resistance-trained males and females, again, something that I do like because, again, we're getting sort of an equal representation and it's sort of a global look of this study and sort of generalizability with regard to it. And like I mentioned before, they're looking at bench pressing. So the bench pressing protocol involves subjects bench pressing for 4 sets of 10 repetitions at 65% of their 1 rep max with 2 minutes of rest between sets. That 5th set was their performance test. So they dropped their intensity down to 60% of their 1 rep max and performed it for as many reps as possible, so to maximal failure. Now, there were 3 conditions in the study, and with regard to these conditions, all participants performed them with 40 to 72 hours between sort of bouts of exercise and trials. So the 3 conditions were rinsing 25 milliliters of the solution in their mouth for 10 seconds, 30 seconds before their next set of bench pressing. Okay, so it's just a 10-second rinse, 30 seconds leading into their next bout of exercise. So interesting protocol, but it's cool. It'd be interesting and funny to see somebody rinsing carbs, in the gym, but this is what they have to do to get the results. So I'm sure it's okay. Importantly with this study, and I thought was pretty cool as well, it was a double-blinded study, aside from the water trial. So it was double-blinded, which is always good with regard to these sorts of studies. So outcomes that they wanted to look at. So they wanted to look at sort of, as I mentioned before, that maximal failure bench pressing. So bench pressing to max on the final set. So that was their performance test. They also wanted to look at RPE ratings, pleasure, displeasure ratings. So that's just sort of how they felt in between rest periods. They also wanted to look at blood glucose and lactate samples, which were taken 60 seconds after the final set. But certainly the big one is the performance aspect of this study. Like, does it work? Does it not work? Specifically with regard to resistance exercise. So again, no surprise here, as I mentioned before, a bunch of spoilers. There was nothing. There was no sort of significant benefits with regard to mouth rinsing. So it does fill a gap with regard to maybe the lead up to sub-maximal exercise, but yeah, there was certainly no ergogenic effect of carb rinsing. And as I mentioned before, it goes against the author's hypothesis, their original hypothesis. So I think it, again, publishing these sort of results and this data, we don't always have to find something. It's okay to be wrong and go against your hypothesis because it still answers something, right? Yeah, this one's actually kind of interesting with regard to comparing the placebo versus the actual carb with regard to rinsing, especially on the performance test. There was no significant difference between the two. There was compared to water. But if we look at, not statistically significant, but if we look at reps, the placebo actually performed 1 rep more than the carb rinsing. So I don't want to say it's not beneficial to mouth rinse, but the placebo performed 1 extra rep. So non-significant rep, but another rep nonetheless. So with regard to not showing anything, and that's okay, the author sort of rationalized a lot of different things and looked at some of the mechanisms with regard to it. So as Mohamed mentioned, with regard to oral rinsing, a lot of it has to do with stimulating the central nervous system. So improving your ability to sort of excite sort of muscles from a global aspect, and then lowering your perceived exertion levels. So your perceived effort with regard to each rep. So this proposed theory suggests significant impacts regarding central fatigue and the potential oral carb rinsing has on minimizing / blunting that. However, the previous 2 papers shed some light that maybe not.
Maybe not the case.
Maybe not the case. But specifically with regard to this, and they wanted to rationalize it as well. So they wanted to sort of answer sort of a hole within the literature. And they also sort of suggested and went back on that and suggested that maybe the submaximal sort of ramp up wasn't enough to sort of stimulate central fatigue in the first place. So even carb rinsing would have no effect because it's submaximal exercise. We haven't even induced fatigue yet, right? So fatigue happens after, and at that point, we're not even rinsing. We're not even rinsing to sort of minimize the role that fatigue plays. So that makes some sense there as well. And then they sort of, again, referenced a few different papers from a whole body perspective with regard to resistance exercise, which some of the literature has shown some benefits. And the author sort of rationalized this as saying that maybe when we isolate a muscle group and we only do one exercise, that maybe it doesn't do anything. But let's say we do a bunch of whole body exercises and maybe interval it, it might have something to do with it. So with regard to isolating and then sort of a grouping of different muscle groups all at once, maybe that would have a benefit, but I don't know. I'm quite skeptical of it. I'm sure Mohamed did as well. So that sort of leads into the discussion with regard to our first question, and that is, and I'll pose to you, Mohamed, is oral / mouth rinsing beneficial? From a global perspective, doesn't matter what exercise. Do you think it's beneficial? And if you want to isolate an exercise, certainly you can do that as well.
So okay. So there's also I'm gonna first of all start off by saying that even though we seem to be giving mouth rinsing a little bit of a hard time. But I think it's understandable why people were thinking about that potentially as being it, because I mean, consuming carbs continuously for a very long period of time like that could put a lot of pressure on the gastrointestinal system. I mean, okay, there are perhaps some issues that were reported back in the past with people consuming carbs, having sort of digestive issues and whatnot as a result of that. And that's actually what the paper, for example, that I discussed, and I'm sure maybe maybe Andrew's paper pretty much like brought this point up as well, perhaps. But it's sort of, I think, very important for us to consider that, yeah, that is maybe the reason why people are thinking about mouth rinsing. Mm-hmm. Now, when you think of mouth rinsing now as perhaps potentially being an ergogenic aid or something, it doesn't seem like that's the case. And that's why, for example, when I go out to people, or perhaps maybe a coach that's trying to improve their athlete's performance or whatever, is trying to think of ways to do that and then start saying, oh, mouth rinsing, absolutely. And then perhaps dismissing things like carb intake or what that might be. Especially if the athlete is doing endurance exercise, they'd actually be doing them disservice. Like they'd actually be doing disservice to that athlete if they're going to go ahead and give him mouth rinsing and then sort of forget about carb intake, which has been shown over and over and over again with the research to be something that is beneficial. So to me, I mean, if you're going to be doing it with other evidence-based approaches like carb intake, doesn't hurt, right? Mm-hmm. But if you're going to be doing it and saying that that's going to be an alternative to other things like carbohydrate intake, then I think we'd now be getting into, I don't know, like just pretty much almost self-sabotage at this point for the athlete.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, I think that it is something that maybe could be advanced a little bit in the research. I mean, are we going to be doing like perhaps now trying to think of, well, mouth rinsing and carbohydrate intake, but now, sort of trying to think of mouth rinsing, think that will perhaps reduce how much carb intake needs to be taken? I don't know. Like that is something that I think is a question that we need to sort of explore in the literature. Maybe being like, okay, so the degree of carb intake versus mouth rinsing, maybe that much mouth rinsing and then maybe reducing carb intake is something that's going to work better than just carbohydrate intake alone or just mouth rinsing alone. So that's definitely remains to be a question. But I'd say that for the time being, carb intake absolutely works. Mouth rinsing, not so much.
Yeah. In isolation.
Yeah. In isolation. Yeah. Like in isolation, it definitely is something that it's pretty clear what's happening right now in the literature. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, you definitely you bring up a good point, especially when you first started there. Like, maybe the rationale with regard to mouth rinsing was to sort of bypass any sort of digestive distress that might be experienced during exercise. Yeah. So you bring up a certainly a valid point there. And then looking isolated effects, like one does, one doesn't. What if we look at the two together compared to sort of the two in isolation? So potentially something Absolutely. That hopefully is in the works, but is cool to see and cool to think about as well.
For sure. And I think that that's really really great pathway for us into the next topic here, because one of the things that comes to mind is that seeing the fact that mouth rinsing does not work based on research. One thing that comes to mind is that paper that you talked about with the gels and all this stuff, where people are trying to think of creative ways to take in more carbs, but having to carry less stuff on their backpack, for example, or trying to think of ways to keep on taking carbs during their endurance exercise. And I remember actually a conversation that I had with a friend of mine. And she was telling me like, oh yeah, she runs a lot of marathons, and she was thinking of ways to optimize her performance, especially when it relates to carb intake. And actually, it is no surprise that we're talking about this topic today, because that's actually sort of my honors thesis project, right? So I'm looking at it, but more so from the side of like interstitial glucose and endurance exercise, and trying to track that over time along with neuromuscular fatigue. But that's beside the point. So I remember that during that conversation that I was having with her, she was saying, well, okay, so in your study, you're giving X amount of carbs to participants, and that X amount of carbs happens to be pretty high. And one of the things that comes to mind is, well, if I want to take in more carbs, as I'm running a marathon, it's like 4 hours, 4 hours, 4 hours and a half, maybe even slightly longer. And I want to take it in continuous boluses, but it's going to be pretty hard. It's going to be pretty damn hard for me to carry all these carbs with me in my bag and to take it over that period of time and to try and improve my performance that way. How can I do that? And I actually tried to think of like practical ways of doing it, but I actually did not have any good answer for it. So are there any solutions that exist out there when it comes to, like, in addition to gels, for example, like if someone wants to look at other alternatives, is there really any hope for someone who, let's say, wants to take a lot of carbs over time to try and improve their performance?
Yeah, you bring up a good point for sure, because the practicality sake of carrying carbs during a race, even if it's an official race or even it's just a local race, um, you want to do your best, and there has to be some way to fuel your exercise and fuel your performance as you go on in the exercise. And certainly looking at it from an endurance perspective, I think coaches, in a sense, and I wouldn't say I'm a nutritionist with regard to it, but you could look at it from a nutritionist aspect. They certainly have sort of maximized the pre-exercise meal timing and individualizing it for the athlete. But with regard to prioritizing during exercise and during performance, carb feeding or any sort of like ergogenic sort of benefit, I don't think a coach has maybe maximized that, because you're seeing manufacturers come out with different ways and different ways to ingest carbs. Certainly the gel form is the most common one from a coaching perspective. I haven't worked directly with an endurance-based athlete, but I know endurance athletes who use gels, and so using and they do come in sort of a package, like a squeeze package. So they're you can carry them to, but you're not going to like lug bottles, right? So I think we're beyond the days of in the form of a liquid carb. I think we're beyond that, just because we've gotten to more of the gel component, where it's less in volume, and you're sort of maybe seeing the same volume of carbs and any sort of ergogenic necessity that you need to maintain performance. But I haven't come across a consistent pattern of during exercise feeding, during exercise, maximization of carbs, because I think it's so individualized. But again, I mean, we can look in the literature and you can read one paper and it suggests that it's this much per hour, and then you read another paper and it's this much per hour, and there's no real overlap. It's two different things. So I think maximizing the during exercise feeding, I think before any of that, with regard to practical purposes, we need to like narrow down sort of that window of how much we need to ingest based on the type of exercise, but then other factors play into it, like the individual as well. And again, going back to what I said previously, that maybe was the rationale for oral rinsing, was to bypass any sort of distress, digestive stress that might be seen with some athletes. So it is an interesting, idea to think about, and hopefully manufacturers are, and I'm sure they are, but fighting each other to come out with new ways to sort of tighten everything down a little bit more, make it more for a convenience sake, make it better, but also maintain the value of during exercise feeding. But yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but
Yeah. I mean, like, okay, one of the things that comes to mind, well, some people might be asking, well, okay, so now you're talking about continuous boluses of carbs during exercise, but what if you just take it as one bolus, right? What if you just go to the athlete, be like, what, I'm going to give you like get crap ton of carbs right before you start the exercise, and then you're pretty much going to keep going for that period of time. But then I think about it, there's actually another paper, and that we're going to be referencing also in the description down below, that does actually touch upon this topic. So they go like, well, we can take a bunch of participants, give them carbs right before they start, or we can take the participants and sort of give them carbs as they're doing the exercise. But then what's interesting about it is that when they looked at things like, for example, glycogen depletion in these participants, so reliance on glycogen, when they looked at perhaps improvement or in performance, they did find that in the participants that had continuous boluses of carbs, they had a lower level of reliance on glycogen. So they had more glycogen stores to sort of show for that exercise. And not only did they have lower reliance on glycogen, they also had an improved level of endurance performance. So they were able to go for longer. And that I think is something that really indicates to us that, again, I mean, you might be like, well, at least something's better than nothing. But for that athlete that's trying to get to that top 1%, they're not thinking about like, oh yeah, let's do it sort of the way that's going to improve me a little bit. No, they're thinking about what's going to improve them the most. Mm-hmm. And continuous intake of carbs does seem to be the actual way of sort of improving your performance as much as possible as a result of carb intake. So I think what you mentioned there, Andrew, with gels, I think that's definitely the most practical way so far. But I think we're really going to have to think of a way to perhaps adjust how we do continuous feeding of carbs, or maybe coming up with creative ways of doing so. But that is a question that still remains to be answered, I think.
Yeah, again, that brings the individual into play, because each individual is going to respond a little differently with regard to the digestive aspect, the performance aspect. Hopefully, again, we can sort of, through, more published literature, we can sort of narrow down the window of it's X amount per hour, it's X amount per half an hour. And certainly it's not going to be a large sum, but the individual definitely is going to come into play with regard to that. But it is interesting, to see that the during exercise feeding is just as important as what we eat before, and certainly what we eat after. That's sort of been hammered home with regard to, decades long studies. You need to eat this after exercise or this leading into exercise. Yeah. And now we're sort of looking at the let's maximize performance during exercise. So it's certainly an interesting time to be alive with regard to endurance exercisers and marathon runners as well. So yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is an interesting time to be alive, indeed. I think looking at all these studies that we've discussed, I think moral of the story: carbs are good. Carb intake during exercise is even better, but carbs are pretty good when it comes to exercise performance. Now, someone might hear me saying carbs are good and is like someone who doesn't do exercise in the first place. And like, yeah, let's go. Carbs, right? Chocolate bars.
Donuts.
High carb. No, go nuts, right? No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying for people that are actually athletes that are trying to improve their performance, carbs are good during the exercise and even prior to it when it comes to certain aspects. And just thinking about that overall, I mean, mouth rinsing, very questionable, doesn't work. But I think that was a really great topic. We were able to touch upon such great papers and sort of trying to explore and really break down all of these concepts and trying to tie it to whole body physiology. But that actually brings us to the end of this episode. So I think this was a great topic. Really looking forward to the next episode with Andrew, where he will be taking us through yet another interesting journey when it comes to exercise physiology and looking at trained versus untrained populations. And thank you, everyone, for listening to us. If you want to check out all the papers that we talked about today, feel free to look into the description section. We actually encourage you to do so. And looking forward to seeing you in our next episode.